jobs, and we're pleased to be rejoined now by Dr. Steve Camarota, who's Skyping in from Washington, D.C. this morning. Dr. Camarota is the Director of Research for the Center for Immigration Studies and the co-author of the new report detailing the displacement of American workers. Thanks for staying with us, Dr. Camarota.
Sure.
Now, we've been talking about the breakdown and who's getting what jobs and why, but I also wanted to kind of take a historical look at this. I mean, how does this differ from other times in history when there have been a lot of immigrants coming into this country, the Irish, the Italian, so forth and so on? Is it different now?
Well, in some ways it's not. I mean, one of the big ways, of course, it's different has not to do with the labor market. In the past, we didn't have a big government, right? Government is over a third of gross domestic product. Back in 1910, during the last great wave of immigration, it was 5%. That's federal, state, and local all together, just about 5%. So a very different situation. In those days, if a lot of low-income people arrived, it didn't really overwhelm the social safety net or anything like that because we didn't have it. Today, It's a very different situation. But in terms of the labor market, in some ways, it's very similar. And in fact, it was only after the cessation of the Great Wave, which lasted 1880 to 1920, roughly speaking, with restrictive legislation in the 20s, that then we saw, and then a low period of immigration for about half a century, that we created the very large middle class that we think of in the 40s, 50s, and early 60s. So you could argue that was a heyday for American workers because immigration was so low. It had reached about 14, 15% by 1920, or actually 1910 was a peak, but about that. By 1970, it was down to less than 5%. And so it had dramatically declined as a share of the population because so few people were coming in. Wages grew, and we created a middle class.
Right. Going back to the now, doctor, what conclusions can be drawn from this analysis?
Well, the main thing is that President Obama and lots of Republicans and lots of Democrats don't even just want to give work permits to millions of illegal aliens. We could debate the wisdom of that. But remember, what they really want to do is dramatically increase the number of foreign workers allowed in, whether it's in agriculture, which is just a small part of the economy, but it's also for hotel and restaurant jobs. It's also for retail jobs, very large sectors. It's also at the high end for nurses and engineers. What the bill that the Senate passed last year, S-744, that the president and lots of Republicans supported, but it died in the House, it would have doubled the number of foreign workers coming in. Instead of 1 million permanent workers a year, it would have been up to about 2 million. And then they also expanded all these guest worker programs as well. But what the latest data show is something I think most Americans know. There's no shortage of workers. Right now, there are about 80 million native-born Americans who are adults and aren't not in the labor market. So what we've had is an explosion of non-work, and yet, unfortunately, both parties, especially the Democrats, but in many ways the Republicans too, are still arguing we need to actually even increase the number of workers allowed in.
Well, Dr. Camarota, with about 30 seconds left to go, what do you think would change the current trend line? Or does it need to be changed, in your opinion?
Right. I think. Look, if we want to get Americans back to work, we have to consider. We certainly don't want to double immigration, and we have to do with what was suggested in the 90s during the Jordan Commission. Barbara Jordan headed a commission that suggested bringing those numbers down to maybe 500,000 legal immigrants a year. But unfortunately, Washington does not seem very interested in doing what's best for American workers, but rather it tends to be representing the interests of illegal immigrants or the companies that want to hire more foreign workers.
And that is the biggest argument against what the president is trying to do by folks like Dr. Camarota. Dr. Steve Camarota from the Center for Immigration Studies, thanks so much for being with us, sir.
Thanks for having me.
All right, much more to come here on America's Forum. We're going to take a look at the political talk shows yesterday. We watched them, so you didn't have to. But important stuff. Stay tuned.